Okay, so when I say Montreal Screwjob, your mind probably immediately goes to Survivor Series 1997 when WWE Chairman Vince McMahon screwed Bret Hitman Hart out of the WWF Championship on the eve of the latter leaving for WCW. And I wouldn't blame you. We naturally try to find the most recent example of things, especially nowadays, and expect them to be the only time in history that that has happened. But what if I told you that this was only the second time the biggest pro wrestling champion in the world was screwed out of his title for real in Montreal? You might think I was crazy, but I can assure you I am anything but. I'm Umar from Retakes Sports, and this is Sports Revisited, the original Montreal Screwjob. May 4th, 1931, Montreal, Quebec, Canada. The AWA champion Ed Strangler Lewis faced off against challenger Henri DeGlane. Now, at the time, the matchup was dubbed the Battle of the Bite. It's now come to be known by many wrestling historians as the original Montreal Screwjob. But before we get into the match, let's talk about how we got there. The first thing you need to understand about pro wrestling is, while the results of the matches are predetermined by bookers, wrestling isn't fake, especially in those days. In that time, wrestling had legitimate strongmen, athletes, Olympians who took their craft seriously and could probably hold their own in any legitimate contest. This was especially true for Ed Strangler Lewis, who by 1931 had established himself as one of the best wrestlers in the world. Lewis, a Wisconsin native, born to German parents, played a pivotal role in bringing wrestling out of the carnival days and into the mainstream. When Lewis started in wrestling, wrestlers were part of an act in a traveling circus. They were considered part of the act and not really seen as a standalone draw. That all changed when these three men came into the fray. Dubbed the Gold Dust Trio, Ed Lewis, Toots Mondt, and Big Billy Sandow changed all of that. Lewis and the others were responsible for adding storylines to hook fans and make people care about the product in the ring and the wrestlers as well. And it helped wrestling outgrow the circus and become its own act. And Lewis was seen as one of the strongest and best pro wrestlers of that era. The legend of Ed Strangler Lewis is you basically had to pay him to lose because when push came to shove, he was going to steamroll the opponent and win anyway. In the year building up to the original Montreal Screwjob, there was tension building up between Lewis and Billy Sandow's camp and that of legendary wrestling promoter Paul Bowser. See, Bowser wanted to put the belt on Gus Sonnenberg, a star in the NFL who was just coming off of winning the NFL championship in 1928. Bowser thought using Sonnenberg's popularity would give the business a boost and began negotiations with Lewis and his manager Sandow for them to drop the belt to the upstart Sonnenberg. An agreement was reached between the two parties to drop the title to Sonnenberg on January 4th, 1929. Part of the agreement was that Bowser would pay Lewis $50,000 from the $70,000 gate receipts for the show. An additional piece of the deal was that when Sonnenberg's popularity waned, the title would come back to Lewis, or Bowser would have to pay an additional $70,000 to Lewis. Now here's where the drama begins. And remember what I said in the beginning. The outcomes are predetermined, but pro wrestling isn't fake. So after Sonnenberg became champion, a rival promoter named Jim Landos sent one of his wrestlers to Los Angeles to get him in a legitimate fight with Sonnenberg. The idea was that Sonnenberg would lose the fight and in the process lose credibility, and in the end, Bowser's business would take a hit. And that's just what happened. So Bowser, seeing Sonnenberg's credibility as champion taking a hit, booked him to lose the belt against Ed Don George, a former Olympian turned pro wrestler who Bowser thought would bring credibility back to the championship. The only problem was that this was in direct disagreement with the deal that Bowser had made with Lewis. See, considering the fact that Lewis wasn't paid when George won the belt, he thought that Bowser had double-crossed him, or to use a more common phrase in wrestling business, worked him, and thought that this would hurt his credibility, as now Lewis had lost to a weak champion without getting his win back. Bowser, on the other hand, seemed to have just forgotten about that part of the deal. Nevertheless, Bowser booked Lewis to face Ed Don George for the title in a match Lewis was set to lose. People thought that if push came to shove, the Olympian George would be able to handle himself if Lewis decided he wasn't feeling like losing. But as we would later find out, and later as stated by George himself, the two were legitimate friends outside of the ring, and George knew he wouldn't be able to beat Lewis in a straight wrestling match. As the two stood in the center of the ring, they would go on to have the following conversation. "Well, tonight's the night," says Lewis. "Oh no," replied George. "Oh yes. How do you want to do this? Do we give these people a great match, or do you want to wrestle?" Lewis said. "Let's give them a great match." To translate that, Ed Lewis essentially gave George an ultimatum. He could either play along and agree to lose, or the stronger Lewis would just pin him down and win anyway. George played along, and Lewis won the belt back. This infuriated Bowser, who then devised a plan to get the belt off Ed Lewis for good. Enter Henri DeGlane, a legitimate Olympian who had taken home gold in the 1924 Olympics for Greco-Roman wrestling. DeGlane was making a name for himself in the Canadian wrestling business and was slated to face the new AWA champion Ed Strangler Lewis in a 2 out of 3 falls match on May 4th, 1931 in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, in a bout that Lewis was told he would win. The bout was set, and as the bell rang for the match, everything seemed to be on the up and up. The first fall went on as planned, with Lewis dropping one to DeGlane before the two retired to their respective locker rooms for the intermission. It was during this time where DeGlane had his manager Dan Koloff bite him near his armpit, leaving a fresh bite mark and drawing blood in the process. Knowing that legitimately getting an unplanned fall over Ed Strangler Lewis was easier said than done, even for an Olympian like DeGlane, this plan was devised to be a safer bet to make sure Lewis would lose the second fall. DeGlane then made his way back to the ring, hid the bite mark by clutching his arm under his chest, and as the two locked up for the second fall, DeGlane jumped in a frenzy, holding his armpit, screaming to the referee, alleging that Lewis had bit him. While Lewis stood there confused, the referee, Eugene Tremblay, inspected DeGlane's wound, and after seeing the bite marks were legitimate, immediately disqualified Lewis. The disqualification meant that DeGlane was awarded the match and, more importantly, the world title. What would follow would be 2 years of squabbling and politicking about who was and wasn't the real world champion. Eventually, DeGlane was recognized as a champion, Lewis moved on after winning other title belts, and was remembered as one of the most consequential wrestlers of his era. They always say, if we're not careful, history is sure to repeat itself. Hopefully future world champions will be smart and choose not to wrestle in Montreal altogether. I'm Umar from Retakes Sports, and this has been Sports Revisited, the original Montreal Screwjob. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, remember to hit that like button, and for more daily videos on wrestling and other sports, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell.